Following Tyson Fury's knockout victory over WBC mandatory challenger Dillian Whyte in his second title defense, there have been a number of people in the media and also among boxing fans who have come out and said that they believe Tyson Fury would have beaten heavyweight greats such as Muhammad Ali, Lennox Lewis, Mike Tyson, etc. in fantasy matchups. Now, I don't think that this is an unreasonable thing to say, and I don't think this is an unreasonable thing to believe, because if there's one adage in boxing which holds true above all others, it is that styles make fights. I don't believe in this idea of an invincible fighter, and I've made several videos over the years pertaining to this. I think that no matter how great you are, no matter how good you are, there always will have been at least one guy around either in your era or in some previous era of boxing history who had your number. There would have been at least one guy, probably multiple, but at least one who had the style to beat you. And he wouldn't necessarily be a guy who had a better resume than you. An obvious example would be Ken Norton. Ken Norton didn't have a better resume than Muhammad Ali, not even close. Ken Norton was wiped out in 2 rounds by George Foreman. Muhammad Ali beat George Foreman. Ken Norton was knocked out by Ernie Shavers. Muhammad Ali beat Ernie Shavers. Muhammad Ali beat Sonny Liston. Muhammad Ali beat so many different people, and I'll come back to Ali a little bit later on. But for some reason, despite the fact that Ali had a better resume than Ken Norton, and he beat people that had wiped Ken Norton out, Ali just couldn't get to grips with Ken Norton's style. And arguably, Norton beat him all 3 times. So that's just one example of how styles make fights. Therefore, I don't think it's unreasonable to believe that Tyson Fury may have had the style, size, ability, etc. I don't think it's unreasonable to believe that he could have beaten some of the greats of the past who may have a better resume than him. But unless we have a time machine to take Tyson Fury back to the 1960s or the 1990s or the 1980s and put him in the ring against Ali, Foreman, Lennox Lewis, Mike Tyson, Holyfield, etc., then we'll never know. It's just conjecture. And I don't think that's the best way to measure greatness. You need to measure it with something a bit more tangible, i.e. achievements, resume, who they actually beat in the ring. The reason why resume is so important is because it demonstrates a fighter's ability to deal with a multitude of different styles at world level. And if they've got a number of victories over all-time greats, particularly if they were in their prime on that resume, then it bolsters their greatness even further. With Muhammad Ali, for example, if you claim that he could have beaten such and such a fighter in a different era of boxing history, then you can point to certain opponents that he beat, certain great fighters that he beat, and say, look here, he overcame a similar style against another big puncher or another great jabber or another great mover, some other great fighter. And that is what I'm basing my argument on, that he could have beaten XYZ. But with Tyson Fury, he doesn't yet have that type of resume. That doesn't mean he couldn't have beaten an Ali or a Lewis or a Tyson. It's possible. Again, we will never know because we don't have a time machine to put him in to send him back then to actually make those matches. It's conjecture. But if we base his greatness upon his resume and compare his resume to other fighters, he isn't in the conversation yet with a Muhammad Ali, Lennox Lewis, Joe Louis, or even a Mike Tyson. So let's have a look at what I'm talking about here. Tyson Fury is 32-0 with 1 draw, 23 knockouts. He has had a total of 5 world title fights. 3 of them have been against the same man. So he has only fought 3 top fighters. One of them was really a top fighter of the previous era. That means he's only fought 2 top fighters of this era. Now, if you're going to prove your greatness, if you're going to be mentioned among the top 5, top 10 of all time, as far as I'm concerned, the bare minimum, the minimum requirement, the entry fee to enter that exclusive club is that you've at least fought everybody or the vast majority of top fighters during your era. That's the minimum requirement as far as I'm concerned. And that is something that Tyson Fury has yet to do. One of the reasons that Muhammad Ali is held in such high regard is because he fought everybody that was around in his era. And of course, Ali's era is split into 2, the 1960s, and the 1970s. He fought everybody who was around in the 60s, and he fought everybody who was around in the 70s. He literally left no stone unturned. Similar situation with Lennox Lewis. There were certain fights that didn't get made, like the fight against Riddick Bowe, because Bowe ducked him. He relinquished his WBC title rather than fighting Lennox Lewis, who was the mandatory challenger at the time. And towards the back end of Lewis's era, he didn't fight the likes of John Ruiz and Chris Bird. But of course, he did fight Vitaly Klitschko and a number of other young heavyweights. So Lewis fought the vast majority of people he was supposed to fight. He fought the Holyfields, he fought the Tysons, he fought the Klitschkos, he fought the Razor Ruddocks. He was the WBC #1 contender at the time. He fought the majority of people, Ray Mercer, Tommy Morrison, etc., etc. I'll come on to Lewis's career in more depth a little bit later on. Joe Louis, similar situation. Joe Louis fought everybody who he was supposed to fight during his era. And he had an insane number of title fights. If we look at Joe Louis's Wikipedia page here, it shows all his world title fights. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28 world title fights. Okay, that's how many world title fights Joe Louis had. Now, they weren't all the greatest opponents. Truth be told, there was a era in Joe Louis's career which they called Bum of the Month Club, where he was just fighting regularly against not the greatest opposition. But again, he fought everybody he was supposed to fight during his era. It wasn't the strongest era in boxing, truth be told, but he did fight everybody he was supposed to fight. Same goes for Mike Tyson. He fought everybody that he was supposed to fight during his first reign as champion. The only person you could say that he could have fought that he didn't was maybe a comebacking George Foreman. But other than that, Mike Tyson fought everybody, all the top guys around during his time. Mike Tyson had 11 world title fights during his first reign as champion. He beat Trevor Berbick to win the title, and he made 10 defenses. Well, he made 9 successful defenses, and then he lost the title in his 10th defense to Buster Douglas. Then, of course, he fought the likes of Henry Tillman, Alex Stewart. He fought Razor Ruddock twice. Then he went to prison. He came back. He fought Peter McNeely. He fought Buster Matthews Jr. Then he fought Frank Bruno and won the title again. And from the Bruno fight, that's 1 world title fight, 2 world title fight against Selden, 3 Holyfield, 4 Holyfield, and then later on, 5 Lennox Lewis. So that would have been, 16, I think? 15 or 16 world title fights in total for Mike Tyson. So let's have a look at Tyson Fury again. He's only 5 world title fights in. He's fought 1 mandatory challenger. He's only fought 2 top guys in the current era. So although he has a lot of potential in terms of getting his resume up to the level of these other great fighters, he's not close yet. I'm just being real. It doesn't mean he can't get there, but he's got a lot of work to do before he does. So if we compare him specifically to Muhammad Ali, because a lot of people believe Ali was the greatest heavyweight of all time, and certainly these 3 fighters, Ali, Lewis, and Tyson, come up time and time again in these conversations for who was the greatest heavyweight ever. So if we look at Ali's career at world level, it began with a sensational upset victory over a very dangerous, feared champion in Sonny Liston. I mean, you had journalists at the time, like Eisenberg, who said that he thought Liston would be champion for life. This guy was running roughshod over the heavyweight division, destroying everything in his path. People were terrified of this man, including the guy who he won the world heavyweight title from, Floyd Patterson. When I say, well, in fact, let me remix that. Patterson was very brave because he wanted to fight Liston when Patterson's manager and trainer, Costamato, didn't want him to fight Liston. So let me not say that Floyd Patterson was terrified of Liston, but his manager and trainer, Costamato, was terrified of Liston. He didn't want Patterson to take that fight. Eventually, the fight did happen against Costamado's wishes. And again, being completely honest here, Floyd Patterson was a protected champion. He was not a guy that was just let off the leash to take on all comers. No, he was a guy who was managed very carefully by Costamado because D'Amato always protected his fighters in the sense that he wouldn't put them in the ring with somebody he didn't genuinely think they could beat. But he did eventually allow Patterson in the ring with Sonny Liston. But the reason that he was so hesitant to do that for so long is because he knew that Liston would wipe him out. And that's exactly what happened when they fought. Liston wiped him out twice in a row, both times in the first round. Now, going into the Muhammad Ali-Liston fight, Liston was a big favorite. Very few people gave Cassius Clay, as he was then, a chance. He'd been dropped in his previous fight against Henry Cooper, somebody who wasn't even in the same league by a long shot as Sonny Liston. But young Cassius Clay went in there and he put on a tremendous display. And he wrestled the heavyweight crown from Sonny Liston, who really, did he win a round in the fight? Maybe the round where Cassius Clay Ali, as he is now, RIP, couldn't see. There was accusations that Liston had put something on his gloves and it got into Ali's eyes, because you certainly see on the film that Ali seems to be in distress in one of the rounds and he's rubbing his eyes and all this kind of thing. But regardless of all that, it was academic because he still managed to defeat Liston anyway. And that was Ali when he was 22 years of age. Now, the second fight was controversial because, as far as I'm concerned, that was a cash-out fight for Liston's mob handlers. They realized that he wasn't able to beat Ali, so I think that they told him to take a dive so they could make some money on gambling. That's my view. But the first fight, tremendous for Muhammad Ali. So if we just forget about the second Liston fight and just count the first, skip over the second and go to the third, we'll count the Patterson fight as Ali's second world title fight, okay? Just in the interest of fairness. So he beats Sonny Liston, beats former world champion Floyd Patterson, beats George Chuvalo, beats Henry Cooper, beats Brian London. So at this point, he's on his fifth defense, his fifth world title fight. His sixth officially, but we'll call it his fifth because of the dubious nature of that second Liston fight. So this is where Tyson Fury is in his career at this point, his fifth world title fight. Okay, Ali here, his fifth world title fight, Brian London. Tyson Fury, fifth world title fight, Dillian Whyte. Now, just look at what Ali went on to do after his fifth world title fight against Brian London. Cleveland Williams wasn't at his best when he fought Muhammad Ali. He'd been shot by police and all that kind of thing, but he was still a dangerous fighter. Ernie Terrell beat him, so he's racking up the world title fights here. Zora Foley was a very good fighter, dangerous guy, 74-7. He then has the issue with the American government, loses his boxing license, is forced into boxing exile, comes back, fights Jerry Quarry, who's a top 10 contender at the time, beats him, beats Oscar Bonavena, another top 10 contender, then fights Joe Frazier for the undisputed. Remember, this is undisputed here. Joe Frazier was WBA and WBC back then. They were the only two recognized sanctioned bodies. He loses to Joe Frazier. He's then in the wilderness for a few years, Muhammad Ali, but he's still fighting top guys. He's not fighting puddings for the most part. He's fighting dangerous guys. He fights Jimmy Ellis, who lost to Joe Frazier. That was also Muhammad Ali's sparring partner. Beats Ellis. Beats Buster Mathis, who was a useful heavyweight. Jurgen Blin, Mac Foster. George Chuvalo was a tough guy, beats him. Jerry Quarry beats him in the rematch. Alvin Blue Lewis. Floyd Patterson beats him again. Bob Foster was one of the greatest light heavyweights in history, a tremendous puncher. Ali beats him. Beats Joe Bugner, of course, of British heavyweight title fame. Then he fights Ken Norton, his boogeyman, or bogeyman as we say in the UK. Loses to Ken Norton via split decision in the first fight after suffering a broken jaw. Rematches him a few months later and beats Ken Norton by split decision. Goes on to fight Rudy Lubbers, Joe Frazier in the rematch, which he wins. So he avenges that defeat to Joe Frazier. Then he fights George Foreman, who, of course, like Liston, several years earlier, or many years earlier, back in the 60s, Foreman is also running roughshod over the heavyweight division. Foreman was actually a prodigy of Sonny Liston. He used to spar Sonny Liston, and he learned a lot from him, including the art of intimidation. Foreman was wiping guys out who had given Muhammad Ali all he could handle, like Joe Frazier and Ken Norton. This guy's dispatching of them in 2 rounds. He's 40-0, all right? They fight in Kinshasa, Zaire, and Ali does the unthinkable. He beats George Foreman. This is a time in Ali's career, I think he was 32 years old. This is a time when people were writing Ali off because he'd had so many tough fights, wars, etc. He'd been beaten a couple of times. And against George Foreman, people were not only fearing that Ali would lose, they were fearing for his safety and his health. He goes in there and he knocks George Foreman out. From there, he goes on to beat Chuck Wepner. And by the way, Wepner was the inspiration for the Rocky movies. If you watch Ali against Chuck Wepner, you can apparently in the crowd see a young Sylvester Stallone. And Chuck Wepner was never happy, by the way, that he wasn't financially compensated by Stallone for being the inspiration for this Rocky character. But that's a subject for another video. Ali then goes on to fight Ron Lyle, another absolute beast. Ron Lyle was not only a tremendous puncher, but he was actually a good boxer too. A very, very tough, dangerous guy. Beats him. Beats Joe Bugner again. Joe Frazier in the Thriller in Manila. Fantastic fight. He stops Joe Frazier in 14 rounds. Jean-Pierre Koopman, Jimmy Young. Fantastic boxer. Very difficult fight for Ali, a technical fight. Manages to win a decision there over 15. Richard Dunn, the trilogy fight with Ken Norton at Yankee Stadium. Alfredo Evangelista. Ernie Shavers, one of the most devastating punchers in heavyweight history. Ali beats him over 15 rounds, okay? Now, Shavers was a limited heavyweight, I would say. I mean, he wasn't wild and ungainly like a Deontay Wilder, but he wasn't exactly amazing aside from his punching power. But if you had coddled Ernie Shavers, if you had protected him and fed him a whole heap of cream puffs in the same fashion that they did with Deontay Wilder, then it's perfectly conceivable that a guy like Ernie Shavers could have been a champion with a long reign if they'd cherry-picked as many opponents for him as they did for Deontay. Not that Ernie Shavers ever was champion, but I'm talking about a hypothetical scenario where you get him a world title fight against the right guy, and then you coddle him and protect him for a number of years. He could have gone on a streak like Deontay Wilder, in my opinion. But anyway, he was a tremendous puncher. Ali beat him. Fought Leon Spinks twice, lost the first fight, became the first heavyweight in history to capture the world title 3 times in the rematch. His last 2 fights against Larry Holmes and Trevor Berbick, he lost, and he really wasn't himself in those fights because he was clearly suffering from early stage Parkinson syndrome. But anyway, that's Muhammad Ali's championship career. His resume is extremely deep. He had a total of 25 world title fights. 25. And he beat multiple all-time greats along his journey. And the most impressive thing about Ali is that he fought so many guys in their primes. He fought Norton in his prime. He fought Frazier in his prime. He fought Foreman in his prime. He fought Sonny Liston, if not in his prime, then very close to his prime. So this guy did everything he was supposed to do in order to gain entry to that exclusive club of greatest heavyweights ever. He did everything. Tyson Fury, again, only 5 title fights in, 3 of them being against the same guy. You can't compare that to the resume of Ali at this stage, 25 title fights in. It's not comparable. Now, Lennox Lewis, as I said earlier, there was a few people that he didn't fight, okay? But for the most part, he fought everybody he was supposed to fight. So let's take a look at it. His championship career began with a 2-round knockout over Razor Ruddock. Well, let me not say his championship career, but this is the fight which led to him becoming WBC champion because it was a final eliminator. The winner became mandatory challenger for Evander Holyfield, who was champion at the time. But shortly after this, Holyfield lost to Riddick Bowe. So then Lennox Lewis became mandatory challenger to Riddick Bowe. But Riddick Bowe refused to fight Lennox Lewis. He vacated his WBC belt. He famously threw it in a trash can on television. And subsequently, years down the line, it came out that, and this is long after Riddick Bowe's career and all that as a serious heavyweight, it emerged that Eddie Futch was the one. Eddie Futch was Riddick Bowe's trainer and I think manager as well, but he didn't want Bowe to fight Lennox Lewis immediately after he beat Holyfield and won the undisputed title. He didn't think Bowe was ready at that stage. And so Eddie Futch blocked the Riddick Bowe-Lennox Lewis fight happening then. Therefore, Lewis was elevated to WBC champion after Riddick Bowe vacated that belt. He fights Tony Tucker, and I should say that with Riddick Bowe, there was a number of other times in Lennox Lewis's career where the Riddick Bowe fight was nearly made. It nearly got made where Bowe's people actually did want the fight later on, but for various reasons, which I'll cover in a second, it didn't happen. But anyway, Lewis's first defense of his WBC title and his first official world title fight was against Tony Tucker. He beats Tucker on a 12-round UD, dropped him twice. Tucker at the time was 48-1, so a good record on paper. His only loss was a points defeat to Mike Tyson. With that being said, Tucker had issues with cocaine and alcohol, so he wasn't in his prime by the time he fought Lennox Lewis, but he was still a useful heavyweight, still skillful, etc. He fights Frank Bruno, turns out to be tougher than expected, but he eventually stops Bruno in 7 in his second title defense. He then fights Phil Jackson, who was 30-1 at the time, stops Phil Jackson in 8 rounds. He then loses to Oliver McCall in a big upset where he's knocked out in 2. Lewis is then confined, or what's the word I'm looking for? Banished to the heavyweight wilderness for several years. Comes back against Lionel Butler, who's a journeyman, stops him in 5. Justin Fortune manages to stop him in 4. He's an Australian heavyweight. Then he fights Tommy Morrison. Now, the Morrison fight was supposed to happen several years prior, when Lewis was WBC champion and Morrison was WBO champion. Not that the WBO was a universally recognized sanctioned body back then. It wasn't. But Morrison still had a lot of fans, and he was still a marquee fighter in the heavyweight division. He was someone that was able to generate a lot of money. And so there was a fight between Lewis and Morrison that was actually signed, but Morrison ended up losing in a warm-up to a guy called Michael Bent. So that fight went down the tubes. Years later, well, it wasn't even that long afterwards that Lewis lost to Oliver McCall. And then after that, of course, Lewis and Morrison were both contenders who were in their heavyweight wilderness, former champions. They fought each other in 1995, and Lewis stopped Morrison via 6-round TKO. And by the way, that was Tommy Morrison's last fight before he was diagnosed with HIV. And Lewis, of course, was tested after that fight because they were, really worried whether Lewis might have caught HIV as well, since he was beating up Tommy Morrison and there was blood flying. But Lewis tested clean, apparently. Now, then Lewis fought Ray Mercer, a former WBO world heavyweight champion, a very tough guy, and someone who had a tremendous chin. I mean, Ray Mercer's chin during his prime years was granite. This guy could take a sledgehammer, a baseball bat to the face. And not only did he have a great chin, he also had a very good jab, particularly by this point in his career. Earlier on in Ray Mercer's career, he'd lost to Larry Holmes. And in that fight, he learned the importance of a jab. So after that loss to Holmes, he went back to the lab and he said, you know what? I need to develop the same kind of jab that Holmes has got. And not that Mercer's jab ever reached that level, but it was very good by the time he fought Lennox Lewis. And that was a real tough fight for Lewis against a tough man with a great jab who was very determined in a small ring. Mercer also a good combination puncher with pretty fast hands. So yeah, Lewis, tough fight there. And this was around the time, it was just before the Mercer fight, when Lewis was mandatory challenger for Mike Tyson. And Mike Tyson paid Lewis step-aside money. I think it was about $4 million because Tyson wanted to go fight either Selden or Holyfield. I forget who it was at the time. But that's what happened there. Now, one of the things I should start mentioning now is if we look at these guys on Lewis's resume up until this point, remember he's had 1, 2, 3, 4 world title fights up to this stage and the final eliminator against Razor Ruddock. Now, compare these guys to the people Tyson Fury's fought. Is Dillian Whyte as good as Razor Ruddock? It's arguable. You could argue that Razor Ruddock is better, and I don't have an issue with someone arguing that Dillian Whyte is better. But bear in mind that Razor Ruddock went 19 rounds with Mike Tyson. I think it was 7 rounds in the first fight and 12 rounds in the second fight. Would Dillian Whyte be able to go 19 rounds with Mike Tyson? You guys let me know what you think in the comments below. Frank Bruno, of course, Phil Jackson, McCall. Is Oliver McCall better than Dillian Whyte? Again, you guys let me know what you think. Is Ray Mercer better than Dillian Whyte? It's up for question, right? Lewis goes on to fight McCall in a rematch, and this is for the vacant WBC World Heavyweight title. He beats McCall. You can't read too much into this fight because of the fact that McCall was clearly suffering from some type of mental health issues. He had well-documented drug problems, etc. And he capitulated in the most bizarre fashion in that rematch of Lewis in 5 rounds. But nevertheless, that was another world title fight and win for Lewis. He then fights Henry Akinwande, who, by the way, knocked out Tyson Fury's dad, John Fury. That fight is actually on YouTube now, after being absent from YouTube for many years. And that was another bizarre fight, actually, because his own corner was shouting at him and telling him, "What's wrong with you? Go out there and fight." But all Akinwande would do was hold. He was absolutely terrified of Lennox Lewis, and he ended up being disqualified in 5 rounds. Then Lewis went up against Andrew Golota, who, again, a very talented heavyweight. This is a guy who, in fact, let me just tell you a little bit of the story of Andrew Golota. So he had a good amateur background for Poland. He was in the Olympics. And after his amateur career was over, he got in trouble with the law in Poland. I think he beat some guys up in a bar or something like that. The police were looking for him, so he fled the country and he moved to the United States. And when he arrived in the United States, his intention was to be a truck driver, a long-haul truck driver. That's what he thought he was going to do for a living. But I guess it wasn't working out that well. I don't know. He ended up going to some local boxing gyms where they encouraged him to turn pro. So he turned pro, and he was eventually signed by Lou Duva. And even from Golota's early pro fights, he showed that he was a little off in the head. There was a screw loose there. Because as talented a heavyweight as he would do strange things in the ring. The first sign of that, I think, was in the fight he had with a Samoan heavyweight who was a big puncher called Samson Puha. And you go watch that fight on YouTube. Puha ends up hurting Golota, and Golota, I think, punches him low and bites him on the neck in that fight. But he manages to get through it. And later on, of course, he fights Riddick Bowe. And in the first Bowe fight, or going into the first Bowe fight, it was expected that Riddick Bowe would beat Andrew Golota fairly comfortably because Bowe had shown some very good form. He had knocked out Jorge Luis Gonzalez in very good fashion. Gonzalez was an excellent amateur who'd beaten both Bowe and Lewis and Teofilo Stevenson, one of the greatest amateur heavyweights of all time. Jorge Luis Gonzalez had beaten all those guys, although Lewis was at pains to point out that he avenged his loss to Gonzalez in the amateurs. But either way, Gonzalez is a very good fighter. Bowe absolutely decimated Gonzalez and gave him his first pro loss. Fantastic performance. So Bowe was looking real good going into the Golota fight. Very few people gave Golota a chance. Golota ended up beating the living daylights out of Riddick Bowe in that first fight. But because Golota is crazy and it's difficult to understand what goes on in that guy's head, he threw the fight away against Riddick Bowe by throwing repeated low blows and got himself disqualified. And there was a huge riot in Madison Square Garden after that first Bowe-Golota fight. The rematch happened a while later, and it was an even more wild fight where Bowe was down several times and he looked to be, headed for a defeat this time rather than a disqualification win. And Golota inexplicably threw the fight away again and got himself disqualified again. Unbelievable. But anyway, Golota was seen as a wild heavyweight, an erratic guy, but very, very dangerous and very talented going into his fight against Lennox Lewis. So as you can see, Golota's record was 28-2. Those 2 losses were both disqualification losses to Riddick Bowe, okay? And this was seen as a 50-50 by many people, Golota against Lewis. Lewis went in there, knocked Golota out, I think it was in 90 seconds. Absolutely wiped him out. He then goes on to fight Shannon Briggs, who was 30-1 at the time. Briggs is one of the most explosive heavyweights I've ever seen in his prime. Never mind about the Let's Go champ Shannon Briggs and the Shannon Briggs who fought Vitaly Klitschko. That's the old man Briggs. I'm talking about the Shannon Briggs from the 1990s. You go look at his highlight reel. This guy was incredibly explosive. Fast hands, big puncher, very athletic. And certainly in the Lewis fight, you could see, and Lewis is an athletic heavyweight, but compared to Briggs, he looked slow. Not that Lewis was in his athletic prime during that fight. Lewis's athletic prime was probably a few years earlier when he fought Razor Ruddock, but he was still an athletic heavyweight at this stage. But Briggs' athleticism was on another level. Be that as it may, Lewis was able to overcome Shannon Briggs in 5 rounds, and Briggs said that above all other attributes that Lewis possessed, it was his physical strength that impressed him the most. So Lewis defeated Briggs. He goes on to defeat Željko Mavrović, a Croatian heavyweight who, again, very underrated. And it's unfortunate that Mavrovic's career ended here. He was 27-0 going into the Lewis fight. Again, this is a WBC title fight, so Lewis is really racking up the title fights by this point. Mavrović undefeated 27-0. He'd knocked out British fighters like Julius Francis. I think he knocked out Clifton Mitchell as well, didn't he? Knocked out a number of other people and fights Lennox Lewis and gives him a tough test. Lewis wins the fight on points, but it's a tough test. Mavrović is a very good fighter, but he comes down with some type of illness after the fight and he's forced to retire. Bizarrely, I think Mavrović actually made a comeback. Was it last year, this year? I guess he must be in his 50s. Don't know what that's all about. But after the Lewis fight, he retired because of some type of injury. It kind of reminds me of Dmitry Pirog. You know, the guy who knocked out Danny Jacobs back in the days? He showed so much promise, but he came down with some type of illness and he had to retire. Similar situation with Željko Mavrović. But that was a good win for Lewis against the undefeated, dangerous guy. Then he has the undisputed fights with Holyfield. The first fight, of course, very controversial because the majority of the boxing establishment, the boxing press, and fans believe that Lewis got robbed in that first Holyfield fight. It was officially a split decision draw. The vast majority of people feel like Lewis won it comfortably. So they have a rematch, and Lennox Lewis wins the rematch on a UD, but it was actually a closer fight than the first fight. Even though the first fight was, again, officially a draw, most people think it was Lewis wide. The second fight was Lewis UD, but a lot of people think it should have been maybe Lewis SD, or at least Lewis by closer margins than the judges had it, because it was actually very competitive. Nevertheless, Lewis wins that. He's undisputed champion at this stage. He follows up, and of course, you know, when you're dealing with Holyfield, you're talking about an all-time great here. He follows up with a win over undefeated Michael Grant, who was 31-0 at the time, knocks him out in 2 rounds, devastating fashion. Francois Botha, who's a veteran, 40-2 at the time, former world heavyweight champion. David Tua, a very dangerous fighter from New Zealand with a hellacious left hook and a granite chin. That was David Tua's second pro defeat. His first pro defeat was several years earlier against a guy called Ike Ibeabuchi. And Ike Ibeabuchi, if you talk to any boxing historian, they'll tell you that he was one of the biggest wastes of talent that you'll ever see in the heavyweight division. This guy was ferocious, and he was not only a guy with tremendous punching power, good boxing skills, good chin, great stamina, great work rate, solid fundamentals, good balance. I mean, Ibeabuchi was the real deal, but he was crazy. Not just crazy like Andrew Golota. And by the way, I should finish the story about Andrew Golota. I know I'm jumping all over the place here, but years after Golota's career, he was deported from the United States, where he'd been living for all these years, because he was caught with a load of guns and he was caught impersonating a police officer. So that's what Golota was like. Ike Ibeabuchi was even more crazy than Golota. There were crazy sparring stories about him and Ezra Sellers, for example. Go read up about his sparring fight, crazy fight that he had where he tried to strangle Ezra Sellers in the gym after a sparring session. There was the crazy situation that landed him in prison. And as far as I'm aware, Ibeabuchi's still in prison. I know he came out of prison, or he did. He came out of prison briefly a couple years back, but then I think he went straight back in for violating his parole. So yeah, that was Ibeabuchi, a tremendously talented heavyweight. And he was so formidable that Mike Tyson at the time was asked which of the upcoming heavyweights, and this included the Chris Birds and the Klitschkos and all that, as well as David Tua. Mike Tyson was asked, and Mike Tyson, of course, was still active at this time. He was asked which one of the upcoming heavyweights he saw as a threat. And Mike Tyson said he saw none of them as a threat other than Ike Ibeabuchi. So, Ibeabuchi was the guy. Obviously, he didn't go on to deliver on his promise and on his potential, but we saw a lot in his fights against Chris Bird. He wiped out Chris Bird, who, of course, beat Vitaly Klitschko. And even if Klitschko hadn't pulled out of that fight with a bad shoulder and Klitschko had won on points, it still went the distance. Ibeabuchi wiped this guy out. Ibeabuchi beat David Tua, gave him his first defeat. So anyway, Tua was a formidable guy. And by the way, that fight that Tua had with Ike Ibeabuchi was, at the time, it broke the record for the largest or the highest number of punches landed, the most amount of punches landed in a 12-round fight in CompuBox history. So a hell of a fight. Go watch it on YouTube if you haven't seen it. David Tua versus Ike Ibeabuchi. Well, Lewis goes in there and completely nullifies David Tua. It wasn't a back and forth seesaw battle like Ibeabuchi versus Tua. No, Lewis just goes in there, sticks a jab on Tua, doesn't let him get close, in a similar fashion to how Tyson Fury did against Dillian Whyte. Just stuck him on the end of a jab and said, "Come and get me." And David Tua, as ferocious a puncher as he was, tremendous chin, good head movement, etc. The main weakness with David Tua was slow feet. Just like Dillian Whyte, slow feet. Couldn't get close to Lennox Lewis. Lewis just shut him down. And again, if you want to compare resumes and the quality of fighters, is Dillian Whyte better than David Tua? Would Dillian Whyte beat a prime David Tua? Was Dillian Whyte better than Holyfield? Would he beat the Holyfield who Lewis beat? Would Dillian Whyte beat Shannon Briggs in his prime? Would Dillian Whyte beat Željko Mavrovic? Would Dillian Whyte beat Henry Akinwande, who was a good boxer? Would Dillian Whyte beat Oliver McCall? Would Dillian Whyte beat Ray Mercer? Etc., etc. You could also match Deontay Wilder up against a number of these guys. But boxing resumes are not just based upon one or two fights, one or two victories, of course. It's a whole body of work over a number of years. So anyway, Lewis goes on to fight Hasim Ratman. Of course, he loses the first fight, avenges the defeat a few months later in Las Vegas, knocks Ratman out in 4 rounds, goes on to fight Mike Tyson. And even though Lewis and Tyson are roughly the same age, and neither of them are in their prime by this point, Lewis was still closer to his prime than Tyson. He'd lived a cleaner life. He hadn't taken as much punishment, and therefore he had a lot more left. And also, Lewis's style aged a lot better than Tyson's style, because Tyson's style was high energy. And a high energy style, usually doesn't age well because youth is necessary to fight in a high energy style. And when your testosterone levels are no longer as elevated as they are when you're young, you start getting older, you can't fight with the same high energy. So yeah, Tyson certainly wasn't as, not that Lewis was super fresh, but Lewis was still quite a bit fresher than Tyson at this stage, even though they were a similar age. So Lewis ends up beating Tyson, of course, who was an all-time great. Vitaly Klitschko, that's the last fight in Lewis's career. Now, to this day, people talk about this fight as if it was controversial. It wasn't controversial. Vitaly Klitschko suffered such severe cuts to his eye, his cheek, and his mouth that it required over 70 stitches and plastic surgery to actually repair. A guy with those types of injuries cannot be allowed to continue. You can see the very punches that caused the cuts. The first cut on Vitaly Klitschko's eye, you can see the right hand that lands on his eye from Lewis, and the blood immediately start trickling down. I think it was the start of the second or third round. So it was cuts caused by punches. They were horrendous, and therefore that fight had to be stopped. There was no I don't know why people are acting like it was controversial. It wasn't controversial. The only controversy is the fact that Lennox Lewis promised Vitaly Klitschko a rematch, and he didn't follow through on the promise. Lewis was actually supposed to fight Kirk Johnson. Klitschko was actually scheduled to fight on Lewis's undercard. And Klitschko said he'd been studying Lennox Lewis for years, so he didn't mind at all taking this world title fight on 2 weeks' notice because he'd been training anyway. He'd been studying Lewis for years, and therefore he was just replacing Kirk Johnson. That fight didn't happen for whatever reason. Vitaly was going to be on the undercard anyway. They moved him up to the main event. Lewis said, yeah, I don't care about this Klitschko guy. He's just another Andrew Golota. I'll wipe him out easy. Lewis goes in there, of course, a career heaviest, not in the greatest of shape, been out the ring a year. He's pushing 40 at this stage. He has a real tough fight with Klitschko. And, after the fight, he decides, you know what? I'm not going to give the guy the rematch that I promised him. I'm actually going to retire. And that's the reason that Lewis gets so much stick for the Klitschko fight. It's not the fact that it was a dodgy result. No, he won it fair and square. It's that it was a real tough fight and he didn't give the guy the rematch that he promised him. And the way I saw it was Lewis, early on in his career, said that he had studied the careers of Sugar Ray Leonard, Muhammad Ali, etc. And he saw all his heroes carry on for too long because of the law of the attention, the money, and the challenge. He said that, I'm paraphrasing, but this is what Lennox Lewis said in a documentary shortly after he won the WBC, well, he was awarded the WBC heavyweight title. He said, there's always another challenge out there. There's always going to be some guy who steps up and, acts like he's the number one contender and the heir to the throne and he wants to fight you. So they're always going to try and get you to carry on again and again and again. You have to know when to cut all that stuff out and say, no, I'm going to walk away now. It doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter about this new challenger or this new thing or this new, I just have to walk away now on top. And that's what Lennox Lewis decided to do. But again, if you look at his resume, 17 world title fights, multiple Hall of Fame victories. Okay. Tyson Fury, where's he at? 5 world title fights, 3 against the same guy. He's not there yet. Long, long, long way to go. I think that Tyson Fury is going to need to have at least 10 world title fights before we can start including him in these conversations. So put him in there against Alexander Usyk, Anthony Joshua, some of the upcoming guys, let's say Philip Hrgovic, Michael Hunter, maybe Joe Joyce. Those 5 guys, put him in there, see what he can do. Then we can start bringing him into the conversation. Once he's had at least 10 world title fights, maybe fought another mandatory challenger or 2. How, is that possible that Tyson Fury will go on to do that? I hope so, because I think he's got tremendous potential. But the way Tyson Fury is managing his career it appears as though he wants to go down the Mayweather route. And Mayweather wasn't about fighting everybody. That's never been what Mayweather was about. He was always a guy who wanted to pick his fights carefully and who wanted to play on the ignorance of boxing fans by saying that, oh, I'm the only undefeated champion in history and I've got this record and that record. People that weren't well versed in boxing history would believe the stuff that Mayweather was saying because, of course, there were other people out there like Ricardo Lopez. There were other people out there like Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., who never lost the fight until he was like 90-0. So Mayweather would take advantage of the ignorance of boxing fans and he would retire, quote unquote, in order to allow the other contenders and the other champions in the division to beat each other up. And then Mayweather would strategically wait until there was one man left standing and then he'd come out and fight that man. And he would, by doing this, keep up this illusion that he was unbeatable. But the reality is he didn't face everybody. He never fought Costa Tszyu. He never fought Paul Williams. He never fought Antonio Margarito. There was a number of people. He never fought Winky. There was a number of people that he didn't fight. I'm not saying that any of these guys could or would have beaten Mayweather. I'm saying that you can't give him credit for beating people that he didn't actually beat. This is another thing that Mayweather used to do, which used to drive me up the wall, is when people wanted him to fight, let's say, Margarito or Paul Williams, he'd wait for Margarito or Paul Williams to get beat, and then he'd say, see, I told you he was no good, and you wanted me to fight this guy? What a joke. It's like he was taking credit for somebody else beating them. You see what I'm saying? And unfortunately, it seems like Tyson Fury wants to go down the same road and has been going down that same road for a number of years. I say unfortunate because as a fighter, Tyson Fury's got tremendous potential. But it's just potential as far as I'm concerned. Until he's actually stepped in there with the Usyks, the AJs, and all the other guys I've mentioned, I'm not convinced in a fantasy matchup scenario that he could have beaten all these great fighters that people say he could have beat. I'm not saying that he couldn't have, definitely. I'm just saying that I'm personally not convinced. I need to see Tyson Fury against a multitude of different styles at elite level before I'm convinced that, okay, yeah, I reckon he could have beat Lewis and he could have beat whoever, Tyson, Ali, so on and so forth. Yeah, I'm convinced he could have done that. I'm not yet. Because again, he hasn't been out there and developed the kind of resume and faced the number of different styles at world level to give me that kind of confidence in him. So anyway, long video, but that's my take on Tyson Fury's legacy, his resume, how great he is or isn't yet. I think he's got a lot to prove, and I hope he goes on to prove it. I know he's talking about this Francis Ngannou fight later on this year, relinquishing his WBC title and allowing Deontay Wilder to fight for it against somebody else. Maybe we'll see Deontay Wilder against Dillian Whyte. I mean, the WBC are probably not going to do Dillian Whyte any favors. They might not give him that opportunity. But if that did happen, I've always said, long before Dillian Whyte got stopped by Fury, I've always said Deontay Wilder would wipe Dillian Whyte out. I mean, he'd take his head clean off. I've been saying this for years. So for Dillian Whyte's sake, I hope that fight don't happen. I hope Dillian Whyte fights Derek Chisora or something instead in a trilogy match. But anyway, subject for another video. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I didn't talk that much about Joe Lewis's resume. Also didn't talk that much about Mike Tyson's resume. Perhaps I should just finish up on that. Tyson's resume, again, not the strongest because his era wasn't the strongest. He came after Larry Holmes. Holmes's resume was full of many of the same people as Tyson's, but Holmes fought these guys in their primes. Whereas Tyson fought most of these guys when they were a bit past it. It weren't Tyson's fault. It's just the time when he came around, that's how it was. That's how the heavyweight landscape was at the time. Tyson fought everybody he was supposed to fight. Like Trevor Berbick for the WBC title, Bone Crusher Smith, Pinklon Thomas. Again, these are all guys who lost to Larry Holmes. Tony Tucker, Tyrell Biggs, who was an undefeated Olympian. He fought Tyson when he was 15-0. Tyson had over 30 fights. By that point, that was actually a 15-rounder, you can see here. It didn't go 15 rounds. No danger of that happening. Tyrell Biggs was a tremendous amateur for the United States, beat Lennox Lewis in the 84 Olympics, was part of what many consider to be the greatest American boxing Olympics team in history. At the 84 Olympics, he was in there with Pernell Whitaker and Meldrick Taylor, Evander Holyfield, etc. Tyrell Biggs was part of that team. He won gold, of course, in the 84 Olympics. But unfortunately, Tyrell Biggs had a crack cocaine problem, even as an amateur. And so when he turned pro and started making money, the crack cocaine problem got worse and worse and worse. And that's why the Duvers, who were his handlers, threw him in with Mike Tyson so early on in his career when he was just 15-0, because they knew that it was only a matter of time before somebody else beat him due to this crack cocaine problem. So they threw him in with Tyson and he got destroyed in 7 rounds. It was what it was. Tyson fought Larry Holmes, of course, who was an all-time great. On paper, that's Mike Tyson's best name, but Holmes had been out the ring for 2.5 years. He wasn't in shape. He was approached, but Don King came to his home with a bag full of money and said, "You're fighting Mike Tyson." And Larry Holmes said, "What you talking about? I ain't fought. I ain't even trained in 2.5 years. And again, Don King showed him the money and said, "Okay." And Larry was like, "Okay, I'm fighting Mike Tyson." And he thought he would have a number of months to train, but Don King, being the sneaky so-and-so that he is, according to Larry Holmes, he brought the fight forward by like a month, which gave Larry Holmes far less time to train. So Holmes went in there ill-prepared and was knocked out in 4 rounds by Mike Tyson. If there's one win on Tyson's resume during his first title reign, which you could say was his best, it's probably Tony Tucker. And I'm not talking about from the perspective of the greatest fighter on paper that he fought, but Tucker was in his prime at the time. Tucker was 6'5". He was athletic. He was 34-0. He was a good boxer. He was sharp. He was a good counterpuncher. And he came to win. He broke his hand, I think, in the 2nd round against Tyson, and so couldn't do much by way of land that afterwards. But again, he was still a good fighter, and Mike Tyson famously out-jabbed Tony Tucker in that fight. Mike Tyson's 5'10" with a 71-inch reach. Tony Tucker is 6'5" with, I don't know, an 80-inch reach or something. Mike Tyson actually famously out-jabbed him. So yeah, Tucker was probably the best win for Tyson in terms of a guy who was in his prime, had ability, etc. That was probably his best win. I mean, could Tony Tucker have beaten Dillian Whyte? I reckon that's a good fight. You know, prime Tony Tucker, Dillian Whyte, you might pick prime Tony Tucker to actually beat him on points. You guys let me know what you think. Tyrell Biggs, Larry Holmes. Tony Tubbs was a good fighter, 24-1 at the time. Mike Tyson knocked him out in 2 rounds in Tokyo, Japan. Michael Spinks, of course, who was a great light heavyweight, moved up to heavyweight, ended Larry Holmes' reign in those 2 fights, winning on points controversially. He then goes on to fight Jerry Cooney, and he's milking this lineal championship. Where have we heard that before? But that's what Michael Spinks was doing. He was milking this lineal thing. Very few people. There was a minority of people. There was some, but it was definitely a minority who saw Michael Spinks as the real champion in the heavyweight division. The consensus champion was Mike Tyson. So not that many people were buying this claim by Spinks and his promoter Butch Lewis that he was the real champion. But regardless of all that, they made the fight. Mike Tyson wiped out Michael Spinks in like 91 seconds in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Goes on to fight Frank Bruno. And of course, this is when Mike Tyson has split up with Bill Cayton and he's fired Kevin Rooney because they were part of his original team. Earlier, he had lost the last person in his team who he was genuinely close to on a personal level, and that was Jim Jacobs. Jacobs died, and then the only people left in that team were, well, I guess you could say Jay Bright and Aaron Snow were part of the team, but they weren't the inner core of the team. The inner core of the team was Kevin Rooney, Jim Jacobs, Bill Cayton, and obviously Cus D'Amato, but he died before Tyson was champion. That was the inner core, and they were slowly, dying off. Cus D'Amato died off first. Jim Jacobs died off. Then there was just Cayton and Rooney left, and he fired Cayton and Rooney after the Michael Spinks fight and signed with Don King. He then fights Frank Bruno in his first fight under Don King's promotion. Stops Frank Bruno in 5, knocks out Carl Williams, who was a decent heavyweight. He'd fought Larry Holmes and gave a good account of himself against Larry Holmes years earlier. Knocks out Carl Williams in 1. James Buster Douglas stops Mike Tyson in 10. Again, Tyson comes back against the Henry Tillmans and the Alex Stewarts of the world. Alex Stewart was actually a decent heavyweight contender. If you want to call him a contender fringe, Stewart was a pretty decent fighter. Go watch his fights against Evander Holyfield. Go watch his fight against George Foreman. He's better than the 1-round knockout loss to Mike Tyson would suggest. He also fought a guy called Ezra Sellers, who was a real good puncher himself, a southpaw, in a brutal fight. And Alex Stewart, by the way, is British. If you ever hear Alex Stewart's accent, it's kind of a weird mix of British and American, because he was born and raised in London, but then he moved to America later on. He married an American woman, and he had this kind of weird, like British-American type accent. And of course, he, like Dylan White, for example, was of Jamaican heritage. In fact, was he born in Jamaica? Let me just check here. No, he wasn't born in Jamaica, but I think he'd lived in Jamaica earlier on in his life. You see here, born in London, residence Brooklyn, New York, Alex Stewart. But he was a decent contender / fringe contender in his day. Tough guy, Alex Stewart. Particularly go watch the Holyfield fights. Anyway, Mike Tyson goes on to fight Razor Ruddock twice. Again, how well would Razor Ruddock fare in this era? If you compare Razor Ruddock to Dylan White, both guys Jamaican, of course, Jamaican born, both guys known for their left hooks. But Razor Ruddock was way more athletic than Dylan White. Much faster feet. Hand speed, I mean, their hooks were both fast. Dylan White's hook might have a bit more zip on it than Razor Ruddock's hook, but they both had fast hooks. But Razor Ruddock was definitely more athletic. He could bounce around the ring and get here and there and everywhere. And Razor Ruddock definitely had a better chin than Dylan White, for sure. Razor Ruddock would go down in fights, but his powers of recovery were incredible. The only time when that weren't the case was in the Lennox Lewis fight, because he was knocked out in 2 rounds by Lewis, and there was no way that he was getting up after that 3rd knockdown in the 2nd round. But against Mike Tyson, he demonstrated incredible powers of recovery against Bone Crusher Smith. Smith hit Razor Ruddock so hard with a right hand. I mean, Ruddock collapsed to the canvas and he bounced up, like nothing had happened after such an extremely heavy knockdown. Same situation in the Mike Tyson fight, in both Tyson fights. He was dropped heavily in both fights, but rose to his feet, within seconds of going down. And the most incredible recovery that I ever saw in Razor Ruddock's career was when he fought Tommy Morrison. Go watch that fight on YouTube. If that is not the most insane recovery from a knockdown that you've ever seen, Tommy Morrison hits Razor Ruddock with a left hook from hell. I mean, that left hook was one of the, and Morrison was, of course, known for his hook. One of the best left hooks you'll ever see landed in a heavyweight fight was Morrison against Ruddock. Ruddock goes down so hard, you're certain that he's out cold. Ruddock gets up at about 4. I mean, he goes down and he hits his head on the canvas. His head bounces off the canvas. Man jumps up at about 4. Unbelievable. And then he actually gets stopped on his feet in that fight. The referee, Ruddock is not punching back and the referee jumps in and stops it. And of course, Ruddock protests. But anyway, long story short, Razor Ruddock, tremendous powers of recovery, definitely a better chin than Dylan White. If you want to argue that he wasn't as good a fighter overall as Dylan White, I mean, make the argument. But he certainly had certain attributes that were better than White. And again, do you think that Dylan White could have done as well against Mike Tyson as Razor Ruddock did? Given the fact that Dylan White doesn't have that kind of chin, he doesn't have those kind of powers of recovery, he isn't as athletic, he doesn't have the foot speed that Razor Ruddock has. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Anyway, Tyson goes on to fight after prison, of course, McNeely, Mathis, Bruno, Selden, who was a very athletically gifted heavyweight, but chinny. Selden was definitely chinny. Terrified of Mike Tyson. Tyson goes in there, dispatches of Selden, the Holyfield fights. Anyway, this ain't a Mike Tyson career review. This is about Tyson Fury and his legacy. So we'll leave it there. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below about everything else. I'm sure there's going to be some Tyson Fury fanatics cussing me and saying that you hate Fury and he could have beaten all the heavyweights in history. Well, I get it. There's always going to be fanboys who go over the top and they're not willing to actually engage in reason and logic. I'm being reasonable and I'm being logical. I'm not saying that Tyson Fury couldn't have beaten the guys that you think he could beat. I'm saying it's possible, but I don't know, because we don't have a time machine to send Fury back in to see if he actually could beat those guys. But in order to convince me more than I am now that in a fantasy matchup Tyson Fury would win, he needs to build up the kind of resume that those other guys like Ali and Lewis and Tyson and Joe Lewis, he needs to build up the kind of resume that they had. Because that's a more tangible way to measure greatness, a more reasonable way, a more logical way to measure greatness, rather than just some fantasy matchup scenario. Oh, I think he's got this attribute and that attribute, so he beats this guy. Because look, Tyson Fury, of course, is a huge heavyweight, but there have been small heavyweights that have given him issues, like Steve Cunningham. I know the Steve Cunningham fight was a long time ago, but Tyson Fury's yet to fight a mover since then. He's yet to fight a guy with that level of foot speed, athleticism, and boxing ability. So until he does, I'm not going to be convinced that that style is not a problem for him anymore. Yeah? So let him fight an Usyk, let him fight a Michael Hunter, and prove to me that he can still, or that he can deal with that style easily now, where he couldn't before. Muhammad Ali, a similar size to Steve Cunningham. If Steve Cunningham's given Tyson Fury so many issues, tell me why Tyson Fury would absolutely destroy Muhammad Ali. Again, I'm not saying that he wouldn't, but I need more convincing. I think Tyson, at least from in my head, Fury's got a lot more to prove before I can be convinced that he would beat an Ali, despite the fact that there's a big difference in size. Now, when it comes to the likes of Lennox Lewis, same for Mike Tyson as well. Mike Tyson is a small heavyweight, but again, same size in terms of weight as Steve Cunningham. And although Mike Tyson didn't have the height and reach of Steve Cunningham, Mike Tyson in his prime had tremendous foot speed, as well as tremendous hand speed. And he certainly fought a number of tall guys and knocked them out for the most part, or at least beat them, like with Tony Tucker, who was 6'5", 82-inch reach or whatever. He managed to out-jab him. Because of, if you have sufficient foot speed, balance and timing, you can be a short guy with a shorter reach and out-jab a taller opponent. If you have that type of skill. Lomachenko has out-jabbed a number of taller guys because of the foot speed and the timing and so on. When you have really good foot speed, it can compensate for a lack of reach. You see it? When you combine it with the timing and all that kind of thing. So, and when it comes to Lennox Lewis, you can't say that Lewis was too small to compete in today's era with the giants like Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder, because Lewis was a very big man. Lewis was 6'5" with an 84-inch reach, a reach only 1 inch shorter than Tyson Fury's reach. You see it there? 84. Tyson Fury's reach 85. So, and by the way, Tyson Fury isn't really 6'9". Let's just recognize the elephant in the living room. He's not really 6'9". He's probably about 6'7.5", because he's been pictured next to a number of people who legitimately are 6'9", and he's clearly shorter than they are, such as Magic Johnson, for example. Tyson Fury was clearly shorter. David Price is 6'8". If you see a picture of Fury and Price together, Price is actually taller than Fury. There's also pictures of Tyson Fury standing next to Marius Wack, who's listed at 6'7", and they look like they're the same height. And one thing that Tyson Fury always does in pictures, if you go look at pictures of Tyson Fury in the gym, he very often stands on his tiptoes because he's trying to appear taller than he actually is. He doesn't just do this in face-offs to have a little bit of a laugh. He does it even in gym photos to maintain this illusion that he's actually 6'9". He's not 6'9". He's maybe 6'7.5", there or thereabouts. And so the difference in height between him and Lewis, you're talking about 1.5 inches. The difference in reach, 1 inch. This is not a guy who's going to be incredibly difficult for Lennox Lewis to reach. And, Lewis fought lots of big guys, both as a pro and as an amateur. And Lewis was generally very aggressive against big guys and would go for the knockout. So, again, if you think that Tyson Fury could beat Lennox Lewis, hey, maybe he had the style to. I don't know. But if I'm trying to base it on something a bit more tangible, then I would have to lean towards Lennox Lewis at the moment, because Tyson Fury hasn't yet proved as much as Lennox Lewis. You see what I'm saying? Perhaps if Tyson Fury builds up that kind of resume similar to Lewis, then I'll turn around and say, you know what? Nah, Tyson Fury would have beaten him. Yeah, that's possible that I'll say that in future. But as it stands right now, Fury's still got a lot to prove as far as I'm concerned in terms of convincing me that he can beat these guys and convincing me that he's as great as these guys, because he doesn't yet have the resume to do that. So anyway, I'll leave it there. Long-winded video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Let the fanboys rage. I've tried to be as fair as possible, but they're not interested in fairness. Of course, they're only interested in fanboying. And anybody who isn't as big a fanboy as they are, anybody who isn't deriding their favorite fighter, is deemed a hater. They've all got, and it's not just Tyson Fury fanboys, of course. It's the Deontay Wilder fanboys, AJ fanboy. Every major fighter has their fanboys. For many, many years, I was clashing with the Mayweather fanboys. The subscribers who have been with me from the beginning will remember very well the Mayweather years when I was constantly going back and forth with Mayweather fanboys. And I did a couple of videos, famous videos now, where I was doing an impression of a Mayweather fanboy. and people in the comment section will tell you about those videos. It was part 1 and part 2 of me putting in an American accent and doing an impression of one of these demented Mayweather fanboys. The kind of crazy stuff they would say about him. So all the major fighters have their fanboys. It's no different with Tyson Fury, and I'm sure they're going to be upset in the comments. They're all going to be like John Fury. You know, John Fury is biased in favor of his son, clearly. But yet he gets angry when anybody else is biased against his son. How does that make sense? This guy's a hypocrite. And with John Fury, of course, he isn't just angry with people who are biased against his son. He's also angry with people like Carl Frampton, who are just being objective. Carl Frampton, of course, rates Tyson Fury very highly. He likes Tyson Fury. But when it comes to Tommy Fury, who doesn't have the background in boxing that Tyson Fury has in terms of the amateur pedigree and, you know, hasn't proved all the stuff that Tyson Fury has proved as a pro, Carl Frampton thinks, well, I think Jake Paul could beat him. And, of course, John Fury goes crazy. A lot of Tyson Fury fanboys are like, they got John Fury's kind of attitude. They're not even remotely interested in trying to be objective when they're assessing Tyson Fury's greatness in his career. You know? That's the nature of fanboys, regardless of the fighter. They're not interested in objectivity. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Catch you guys on the next one. I'm out. If you're tired of the biased narratives and mass censorship on mainstream platforms, and you want to be part of a community of critical thinkers who love free speech just as much as you do, then come and join me on Patreon and access my weekly no-holds-barred, censorship-free podcast where we lift the lid on a wide variety of controversial topics. It's not mainstream friendly, it's not politically correct, but that's the whole point. We dare to stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. Just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called Hatman Hot Topics. You'll gain access to a minimum of 2 hours of exclusive content every single week, including podcasts, videos, interviews, live stream Q&As, as well as my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. Not to mention a vast back catalog of hundreds of hours of previous episodes. You can listen via the Patreon app with the option to download in high quality MP3. We've also got an Element group where you can come and chat and hang out with myself and other members. Unlike Discord, it has full end-to-end encryption, is decentralized, and is 100% censorship free. You can also send voice notes as well as much larger audio and video files than you can on Discord. So come and sign up on Patreon. There's no contract, there's no commitment, you can cancel at any time, and it's cheaper than a cup of coffee. So I'll see you over there. I'm out.